The news from Washington began with a sudden and unmistakable shift in tone. Only weeks ago, discussions between the United States and Canada appeared calm, methodical, and even cordial. There were smiles in the Oval Office, a sense that despite differences over metals and autos, there was space for negotiation. Yet today, the atmosphere is strikingly different. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, has abruptly cut off trade talks with Canada. What caused the change was not an official diplomatic disagreement or a public policy clash, but an advertising campaign across the border, one criticising US tariff increases and urging Canadian businesses and workers to speak out before a key ruling by the US Supreme Court. In Washington, the president framed the campaign not as a routine political gesture from a neighbouring country, but as a deliberate attempt to interfere in an American legal process. He accused Canadian interests of, in his words, trying to pressure and manipulate the US judiciary. The advertising, which aired on television networks and circulated widely online, highlighted concerns in Canada's manufacturing and agricultural sectors, arguing that US tariffs were destabilizing long-standing economic ties. For President Trump, however, the campaign represented something more personal, a challenge to the legitimacy of his trade policies and the institutional decisions surrounding them. This is not the first clash between the US and Canada over tariffs, but the timing is particularly sensitive. The United States Supreme Court is preparing to rule on the legality of the administration's sweeping global tariff measures. The decision is expected to carry far-reaching consequences for steel, aluminum, and automobile supply chains. If upheld, the tariffs remain. If not, the economic map of North America shifts once again. That is the context in which the president cut off negotiations, with the stakes high. Yet the rupture is striking because of how quickly the tone changed. Earlier this month, on October 7th, the two leaders, Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, sat together in the White House in a moment that now feels distant. Cameras captured the president joking lightheartedly about the idea of the United States and Canada merging, a comment made in jest, though observers noted it reflected a broader sentiment of closeness, stability, and shared cultural space. The conversation that day centred on cooperation, shared economic opportunities, and the importance of keeping trade flowing smoothly between the two neighbours. It was a picture of diplomatic ease. But politics can turn quickly, and trade politics often turn fastest of all. For Prime Minister Mark Carney, the abrupt break in talks is a setback, but one he is approaching with measured restraint. Speaking to reporters as he prepared to leave for a scheduled visit to Asia, Carney chose words that neither escalated nor diminished the seriousness of the situation. He emphasised that progress had been made in negotiations before the interruption and that his government understood the importance of continuing discussions when conditions allowed. His message was calm, direct, and aimed at de-escalation. In his own words, delivered in a careful tone, he said, "We stand ready to pick up on that progress and build on that progress when the Americans are ready to have those discussions, because it will be in the best interest of workers in the United States, workers in Canada, and families in both countries." Carney's appeal focuses on the people who feel the consequences most immediately, workers in factories, transportation, agriculture, and logistics. It is in these communities that the real effects of tariffs are measured, not in press conferences, but in production lines, shipping schedules, and household budgets. Across Canada, those effects are visible. In automotive manufacturing hubs like Oshawa, Ontario, assembly lines continue moving even as the uncertainty hangs overhead. Workers weld doors, assemble frames, and move parts along robotic lines. In the broader metals sector, steel and aluminum producers have spent months adjusting supply flows, pricing expectations, and export strategies. At the US-Canada border, long rows of trucks continue to wait to cross bridges that have carried goods for generations. The trade continues, but its future feels less certain. And yet, for now, the core trade relationship remains intact through the USMCA, the trade agreement binding the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Under the agreement, almost 85% of goods moving between the US and Canada are exempt from tariffs. This framework was designed to protect North America's integrated supply chains from sudden shocks. Still, tariff battles have already tested its durability more than once. And now, with negotiations paused, the region faces another test, one shaped not only in Washington and Ottawa, but also in Mexico City. In Mexico, President Claudia Sheinbaum addressed the situation with a tone both confident and steady. While Canada and the US faced turbulence, Sheinbaum stated that Mexico's own trade discussions with Washington are advancing. Her government has sought to present Mexico as a stable partner in the region, a country focused on predictability, investment continuity, and industry expansion. This comes at a moment when Mexico has become the United States' largest trading partner, surpassing both China and Canada in recent data. Sheinbaum's message was concise. She noted that Mexico is well ahead in its negotiations and that clarity would follow internal government meetings. Her remarks, brief but pointed, implied that Mexico's strategy is to maintain momentum and avoid confrontation. But beneath these national statements lies a much broader reality. North America's economies are deeply interwoven. Supply chains do not stop at borders. Cars assembled in Canada include engines cast in the United States and electronics sourced from Mexico. Food, fuel, machinery, plastics, paper, medical equipment, all of these move constantly in vast volume every day. A disruption in negotiations can ripple across thousands of companies and millions of workers. This is why the President of Canada emphasizes workers and families, and why the President of Mexico emphasizes continuity and progress. For Canada, the political messaging aims to calm markets and preserve space for reopening dialogue. For Mexico, it signals stability in a moment when uncertainty is rising next door. Meanwhile, in Washington, the President's posture remains firm and defiant. His administration argues that previous trade frameworks unfairly disadvantaged American workers and allowed foreign governments to shape US economic outcomes. The tariffs were introduced as a rebalancing measure, a way to shift cost burdens and encourage domestic investment. Critics, however, argue that tariffs have raised input costs for US manufacturers and squeezed prices for consumers. Supporters counter that short-term pressure is necessary for long-term strength. These debates have become central to the political identity of the administration. Yet the pressure on the US-Canada relationship is not only economic, it is also cultural, historical, and deeply personal. These are two countries with one of the longest peaceful borders in the world. They share broadcast networks, cultural industries, sports leagues, academic institutions, and countless family ties. When disputes arise, they play out not between distant strangers, but between neighbors who share everyday life. That proximity can intensify disagreements. In Ottawa, government officials emphasize that Canada remains committed to diplomacy and partnership. They have pointed to the long history of successful negotiations and mutual problem-solving. They argue that even during past trade disputes, whether over lumber, dairy or oil, dialogue eventually resumed and pragmatic solutions emerged. That history forms part of the Canadian government's hope that the current rupture will not last. In the United States, advisors close to the president argue that standing firm is necessary to reinforce consistency. They contend that allowing foreign messaging to influence US legal and commercial decisions sets a dangerous precedent. Yet others within the policy sphere express concern that prolonged suspension of talks could introduce shocks at a time when supply chains are still recovering from global disruptions. Workers in steel towns, border crossings, transport hubs and auto plants are watching carefully. Their livelihoods depend on predictability. Many recall earlier tariff rounds that caused layoffs, price surges or logistical uncertainty. Others, however, see tariffs as leverage, pressure that can eventually strengthen their industries if negotiations lead to better access or investment guarantees. Across North America, business leaders and labour organisations alike now wait to see whether the pause in dialogue becomes a temporary reset or a sustained standoff. The stakes are significant, not only for the three governments involved, but for the shape of the continental economy and the stability of supply networks that run across thousands of kilometres. The Canadian Prime Minister's statement, measured, steady and focused on building rather than dividing, reflects a deliberate strategic choice to keep diplomatic doors open. The Mexican president's remarks emphasize positioning and assured progress. The US president's stance underscores sovereignty, control, and refusal to accept what he views as external pressure. Together, these three perspectives illustrate the new landscape of North American politics. Cooperation remains possible. Trade continues. But the balance that once appeared natural and automatic now requires negotiation at every step. Whether talks resume soon or remain suspended will depend not only on politics and law, but also on identity, national pride, and the stories each country tells itself about what fair partnership looks like. And so the trucks continue crossing the bridge, the assembly lines continue humming, the workers continue working.